All right, thank you everyone for joining me for these live internet studies. I do apologize for the 2 weeks back-to-back break that was not in my schedule. I originally did plan to miss Thanksgiving break a while back. That was planned. And then I had another unplanned outage, another unplanned break due to some maintenance and power outages and things out here where I live. So there was little I could do. So I appreciate everyone's patience. It's time to jump right back in. However, we are in Eschatology, biblical study of end-time events, that you can look and see on your screen. And we are in topic 9 with Yeshua's Olivet Discourse part 2. And we took some time out to focus on this sort of excursus material. Let me turn and show you the photo of the book. Looking through Robert Van Kamen's book called The Sign, which is sitting on my shelf right here. And we pulled in 2 chapters where we talked about the signs of Yeshua's coming and of the end of the age. So if you remember, when you go back to Matthew, let me just scroll back up to verse 3. Yeshua's having this discussion with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. This is why it's called the Olivet Discourse. He's sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him, said privately and saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen?" And of course, the context of their question is Yeshua just ended up having in the previous chapter this argument with the religious leaders of his day, and he was just raking them across the coals. And then he kind of concludes this whole thing with, see these buildings, they're all going to be destroyed sooner or later too. He's talking about the temple. And that sparked the disciples' interest. Hey, when will these things happen? So they were really kind of focusing on the destruction of the temple. We can see that in the previous verses there, where he left the temple areas going on his way. Disciples came to point out the temple buildings to him. He responded by saying, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So from verse 2, these things is primarily, from the disciples' limited perspective, the destruction of the temple. Right, and that's really kind of the epicenter of much of Yeshua's prophecies, where he's talking about, there's Jerusalem, there's Israel. If you zoom out, then you zoom in, there's Jerusalem, and then you keep zooming in, there's the temple. So when will these things happen? What will be, notice what their question says, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? At least from this rendering, it seems like there's one sign, but 2 primary events. The sign of Yeshua, the coming of Yeshua and the end of the age. So the primary events that we're talking about are at least the destruction of the temple, because that's part of their question. We're also entertaining the details about Yeshua's prophecy and how they pertain to his second coming, because it says the sign of your coming. And then, of course, the end of the age is the end of this time period, what Judaism calls the Olam Hazeh, which from Hebrew translated into English would be something like this present age, which for a long time the rabbis understood would give way to the Olam Haba, which translated from Hebrew into English would be something like the age to come. So we have this age, and then we have the age to come. This age to come is the Messianic age that the Messiah would establish here on earth for at least 1,000 years, ruling from Jerusalem, from the Temple Mount. So the sign of your coming is part of their question, and the sign of the end of this age leading into the Olam Haba, the age to come. So Yeshua begins to answer and give all these details, and he itemizes all of the, what we would today look back now and understand are the beginnings of birth pangs. So he's describing events that are related to what we're going to find out later on in Revelation are the seals on the outside of a large scroll, and there's 7 seals. So we work our way down through all of these, and we parked ourselves at verse 29 and 30 and 31 for a little while. We talked about these signs, and from my understanding, there are 2 signs. The first sign is the sign of the end of the age, and then the second sign is a sign of Yeshua's return. So chronologically, the events would take place where Yeshua, the Yeshua returns, meaning the rapture, and then the end of the age, and then Yeshua returns to establish his kingdom. How much time is between the rapture and his setting up his kingdom? My understanding is that it's not 3.5 years, but it's not 7 years either. It's probably somewhere, a few years, at least a year. But I could be wrong. It could be like very, very almost immediate. But the point I'm trying to say is that from my understanding and reading through what we saw through Robert Van Kampen's book, The Sign, there will be at least two signs. One of those signs is what Revelation calls the sixth seal, the darkening of the sun, the moon, and the stars, which was prophesied in Joel way back in the Old Testament. And so we can see it right here in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, which is after the midpoint of the week. I'll show you a chart here in a moment. The sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. That's one of the signs. That is what we call cosmic convergence, cosmic disturbance. That language is Zion's Hope Ministries language. Marv Rosenthal, and now his son, picking up where Marv left off, leading the ministry. And they use that language, cosmic disturbance. We'll see in a chart here. So that's the first sign, the sign of the end of the age, which happens chronologically after Yeshua returns. So the signs are out of order, but the events of Yeshua returning and then the end of the age, Yeshua returning for rapture first, then the end of the age, and then Yeshua establishing his own kingdom. That comes next. And then in verse 30, it says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. So that's, to me, is maybe a second sign. And I believe that's the brightness, the brilliance of the flashing of the lightning from the east to the west, the brilliance of his glory supernaturally lighting up the universe, illuminating it in the in place of the supernatural darkness that was created by the first sign in verse 29, where everything goes dark, no sun, no moon, and no stars. And I was thinking, as I was prepping for the study this week, how that some people want to dismiss verse 29 as some form of just eclipse. The sun will be darkened. Well, of course, we've seen lots of solar eclipses, right? The moon positions itself between the earth and the sun, and because of the relative sizes that they look to our observation here on Earth, even though we know that the sun is much, 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 much larger than our own moon. But from our perspective, the distance from the sun to the earth causes it to look about the same size as the moon, so that the moon can easily slip in front of it and create an eclipse, solar eclipse. You guys have all seen what it looks like. I'll flash a picture in post-production of a solar eclipse in case you've never seen one. Well, that could explain the sun being darkened, but notice that the sign says the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Okay, we could say, all right, the moon looks dark during a solar eclipse, so that might kind of fix. Maybe we're talking about a solar eclipse. But when we go back to Joel's rendering of the moon, the sun and the moon behaving oddly, it talks about the moon turning to blood. And we see that again in other passages. We don't see it here in Matthew, but it talks about how the moon turning to blood. Well, that resembles a lunar eclipse. If you've ever seen a lunar eclipse, it's not the moon that's between the earth and the sun. It's the earth that's between the moon and the sun. So the moon's in a different spot. So that when we're looking at the moon, it's the earth that's casting a shadow on the moon. And because of the atmosphere on the earth and things like that, it causes the moon to look orangish, or, you guys have all seen a blood moon and things like that, the heptads. So my point is that we can't possibly have just chalk these up to just mere eclipses, because the time frame that it takes for there to be a solar eclipse and a lunar eclipse at the same time, they can't happen at the same. Impossible, unless the moon suddenly speeds up supernaturally and zips around to the other side of the earth. So first there's a solar eclipse, everyone looks up and says, wow, it's a solar eclipse, and then the moon zips around to the other side of the earth, and wow, it's a lunar eclipse, and then the stars start shooting from the sky, and there's comets and meteoric activity or something like that, right? Well, I don't buy that one. Like I've heard some people say, well, this is just other ordinary type eclipses. No, I think this will be some supernatural event that signals the return of Yeshua and then signals the end of the age eventually. So those are the signs that we talked about in previous videos. Go back and listen to those and studies. But now let's go forward and move from verse 30 and 31, where he talks about the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the sky. All the tribes of the earth mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So this could be the rapture, which I believe it is. But remember, Yeshua's return to planet Earth is broken up, and his itinerary is broken up into different activities, not just the rapture, where I don't believe he touches ground there. Instead, we go up to meet him in the air, and then there's some other activities that still take place here on planet Earth. Other things that must take place, such as the Battle of Armageddon must take place here on Earth. And during that time, Yeshua won't be here on Earth during the Battle of Armageddon. I think most people would agree that Yeshua won't be here there. Then, rather, once we get closer and closer to the end of the 70th week, then there will be this expectancy that the Lord's going to cut things short by defeating Antichrist and establishing his kingdom. But as we're reading these passages, Yeshua's going to give us more details leading up to that time. So he kind of shifts the focus once we get to verse 31 and following. He shifts the focus towards helping we as believers to understand not just the urgency, but the immediacy, or how near will his return be from the time that he's talking. Is it imminency, like many people teach, where he could return at any moment? Or, as we've just seen, there are all manner of events that must precede his second coming, his return to planet Earth. And so he begins to tell the disciples, and he gives them with kind of not really signs per se, but just activities on Earth that will indicate, hey, that the time is drawing close. When you see certain things happening, when the state of affairs of humanity is in this particular mindset. So let's keep reading. Verse 31 says, he'll send forth his angels with a great trumpet blast, and they'll gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. That, my understanding is, that's the rapture event. That is not the second coming. That's the rapture. So from my understanding of eschatology, the rapture is one event, and the second coming is a second event, and they are not to be confused with one another. There's a space of time between them. So before we jump into starting at verse 32, let me just look at some charts. This one is a chart of Matthew 24 parallel to Revelation chapter 6. We looked at this in the past, and you can see just from glancing at the chart that what Yeshua gave his disciples in Matthew 24 perfectly parallels what he gave John in Revelation chapter 6 and beginning with chapter 7. And it should be, because it's the same author, right? The Lord Jesus Christ himself. So the parallels that are running right down the middle are described by John as the seals. And so we can see seal number 1 through 6 as outlined in the parallel chapter headings or label headings there. And when you get all the way down to interlude in Matthew 30 and 31, this corresponds with the interlude of Revelation chapter 7, 9 through 17, an interlude in the break of John's sequence of seeing this vision or this revelation that Yeshua is giving to him, that the parallel right in the middle calls the raptured saints. And then as we keep moving past that, in Matthew chapter 24, jumping back up to verse 14, but then jumping down to verse 30 and then continuing through 37 to 41, we see the outpouring of this extremely important time frame on planet Earth known as the wrath of God, or the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord's wrath, the day of God's judgment. It goes to a few different titles in the Old Testament, but the most prominent one is the day of the Lord. So we're going to use that one to primarily mark it out. So this parallel, known as the day of the Lord, has a parallel in the seventh seal and the trumpets and the bowls. So the final judgments, so let's jump to a different slide. The final judgments that are going to be poured out in the end of days, if you look at this chart here, is indicated by the yellow arrow on the right side of your screen pointing off to the right. So reading from left to right, it's just the 70th week of Daniel that commences with Antichrist making a covenant at the far left, which corresponds to the first seal. And then you can see the seals going in sequence down on the bottom of your screen from 1 all the way over to 6. The 6th seal is that sign in the sky, the cosmic disturbance. I'll show you in another slide here in a moment. That was described originally way back as far as Joel and Isaiah and other Old Testament prophecies that Yeshua picks up on, and that other New Testament writers pick up on, as the sign, at least, of the end of the age, and perhaps even, as some Bible teachers would say, would be the sign of Yeshua's second coming. Notice the little arrow on the top just above the break between the Great Tribulation and the Day of the Lord. You see that little arrow pointing down where it says, coming of the Son of Man, date unknown. That was what I would call the rapture. And yet there's another arrow to the far right at the top, upper right corner, that says Jesus' reign in Jerusalem begins. That is what we would call the second coming. So notice the space between the two is occupied by the events known as the Day of the Lord, which are the seventh seal, which opens up the seven trumpets, and then which also contains the seven bowls. And we'll get to those in time. Let's jump to another slide real quick. Here's the pre-wrath rapture view that we're going to turn to shortly, not tonight. We have to finish up Matthew 24 first, and then we might do a little excursus on the Thessalonian letters from Paul to pull in their relevance for the eschatological events, but it won't be a long study there for Paul. I won't go out, drag that out for months. It'll just be either one or two shows. And then we're going to jump right into, if you look at my schedule here, topic 10, rapture views and overview, and then we'll start talking about rapture for the next 1 to at least 3 sessions in my topics 10, 11, and 12, rapture views and overview, making case for the pre-wrath view, and then rapture views of final analysis, topic 12. Well, when we start looking at pre-wrath, just as a kind of a sneak preview, the pre-wrath view is that when we're talking about the timing of the rapture, the pre-wrath is that we as believers will be raptured or taken to be with Yeshua prior to the outpouring of God's final wrath on planet Earth. So we don't equate the entire 7 years with the tribulation. We segment the Great Tribulation as a part of the 7 years. We pre-wrathers, we relegate the Great Tribulation there kind of in the middle to this slice of history where it's Satan's wrath and man's wrath that's being witnessed on planet Earth with all that confusion and bloodshed and loss of life and destruction. But then all of that is cut short by the cosmic disturbance and Yeshua supernaturally lighting up the sky and rescuing his genuine saints and genuine followers, and then on the same day, wrath is poured out. So the saints go up and the wrath comes down is eventually what happens. We can see also in this next slide that I borrowed from Zion's Hope, again, Marv Rosenthal and his ministry there that's being headed up by his son now, since I believe Marv passed away. The 7th week of Daniel parallels with Revelation chapter 6 against the same information that we've been looking at over and over again. This is the pre-wrath perspective. 7 seals, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Notice number 6 is the cosmic disturbance. This is all just recap. And then when we zoom into that, zoom into that 6th seal as it leads into the 7, we can see these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 reasons why the pre-wrath view is the one that seems to be the best of all the options, because of all the details that were already given to us in other places. The Bible show us that there is a sequence of events that lead up to the outpouring of the day of the Lord, and since the day of the Lord is equated with the wrath of God, and since we believers are not going to go through that, then these events happen as convergences before the 7th seal. Thus, we believers won't go through the events contained in the 7th seal. In other words, we won't go through the wrath of God. So we must be taken out of the way, rescued, prior to God pouring out his wrath and judgment on wicked humanity. And so we'll get to that in time. All right, so having said all of that, that's kind of our intro to catch us up. And I took a little bit longer because of the 2-week break, and there are people who've lost a little bit of the momentum of our studies because of the breaks. So this is kind of like the catch-up part. This is like if you ever watch a drama on Netflix or a TV show, and you start the show and it says previously on, and then for the next minute or two, they show you flashback scenes of previous shows, so that now that you're watching the current episode, you understand, that's what happened. Okay, in case you weren't binge watching and you skipped between whatever show you're currently watching and the show you previously left. Well, that's what I just did. I did a little previously on for us. Okay, so having said that, let's jump into our study. So we're reading through Matthew 24, and this is kind of like the second half. The first half I used my own notes that I put together, but I felt that they were really too brief because I put them together like 20 years ago. And they weren't designed to be exhaustive. And so they're really kind of like one verse and then one little saying, one little paragraph, one little comment on each verse. I prayed about it and I thought that, why don't I just go ahead and borrow notes from someone who's done a little bit more research than myself, and I decided to choose Pastor David Guzik for the second half of this Matthew excursus. So again, looking at this, we're on Yeshua's Olivet Discourse part 2, and we opened up basically by looking at all of those signs leading up to what Yeshua calls the end of the age and his second return. But now we're ready to start reading the verses themselves. Parable of the fig tree. So let's read like verse 32 through 35, and then I'll jump over to the commentary section, which we're going to borrow. This is David Guzik's. I'll back up a little bit for 29 and 31, and you can see some of those first. But eventually, Yeshua's going to start telling his disciples about signs or ways to discern that his return is near. And is he telling them that it's imminent? I don't believe he's telling them that it's imminent, that it could happen any moment. In fact, if it were imminent, we wouldn't really, and I kind of highlighted this last week or 2 weeks ago before the break, 2 or 3 weeks ago. If there was imminency, true imminency after Yeshua left, then why even give us the signs at all? The sign of your coming and of the end of the age. Why do we need a sign? Why do we need signs if your return is imminent and nothing is necessary before you actually just zap into place and show up? I've heard many preachers say, Jesus could come back at any moment, and they almost describe it as if he could come back before I finish my sentence telling you that Jesus could come back. As if I'm going to say, guess what, people? Jesus could come back before, and then boom, the rapture happens before I even finish saying before. Well, that's like, hyper imminency or something to that effect.